In 1960, Britain made 17% of the world's manufactured goods. Japan made 3%. By 2000, those numbers had completely flipped. What changed? It wasn't intelligence. It wasn't resources. It wasn't luck. It was something so simple that Western companies completely overlooked it. And once you understand what it was, you'll see why Japan won and Britain lost. The British legacy. Britain's engineering supremacy was not accidental. During the Industrial Revolution, British engineers pioneered the steam engine, developed mechanised textile production, and created the world's first intercontinental railway network. Names like James Watt, George Stephenson, and Isambard Kingdom Brunel became synonymous with engineering excellence. This legacy created a culture of pride, tradition, and established practices. British engineering firms viewed their methods as proven and superior. They had solved the major technical challenges. They had created the systems that worked. What emerged was a mindset. If something works, preserve it. Change was viewed skeptically. By the 1950s, this very strength became a weakness. British manufacturing maintained high-quality standards, but those standards came at high costs. Production was slow, customization was limited, efficiency improvements seemed marginal. The engineering culture emphasized craft, precision, and individual expertise. Specialists commanded respect. Hierarchies were rigid. Decision-making moved upward through management layers. A factory worker with an idea for improvement had limited pathways to implement it. Innovation was the domain of engineering departments, not shop floors. Japan's post-war resurrection. Japan's situation in 1945 was the opposite of Britain's. The nation was devastated. Cities lay in ruins. Manufacturing capacity was destroyed. Japan had to rebuild everything from zero. This catastrophe became an asset. Without existing infrastructure to preserve, Japan could start fresh. Without established dogmas, Japan could adopt the most effective practices from anywhere. This necessity bred flexibility and hunger for improvement. Japanese manufacturers faced a critical challenge. They had to compete with established Western companies using limited capital and resources. They could not outspend the West. They could not rely on brand reputation. They could not produce luxury goods at premium prices. They had to outthink their competitors. They had to find radically better ways of producing goods at lower costs while maintaining quality. In the 1950s, Japanese manufacturers began importing knowledge. Toyota sent engineers to study American production methods. Japanese leaders studied quality control concepts developed by American statistician W. Edwards Deming. Deming's ideas, statistical process control, continuous improvement, variation reduction, had been largely ignored in America but found eager listeners in Japan. This knowledge transfer was crucial, but Japan did not simply copy. Japanese manufacturers adapted these concepts and developed them further into something entirely new. The manufacturing revolution. The transformation began in automotive manufacturing. In the 1960s, Toyota was a small player producing vehicles that were often mocked in the West for poor quality and reliability. British cars, Austin, Rover, Jaguar, were sophisticated and admired. They represented engineering heritage and craftsmanship, yet they broke down frequently. Rust appeared after a few years, repairs were expensive and time-consuming. Toyota pursued a different path. They implemented Kaizen, continuous improvement. Every worker, every manager, every department was empowered and encouraged to identify problems and suggest solutions. Factory workers could escalate concerns. Ideas that would improve productivity or quality were tested and implemented immediately. Small incremental improvements accumulated over years into revolutionary advantages. Toyota developed the just-in-time inventory system. Instead of stockpiling parts and materials, components arrived exactly when needed. This reduced waste, lowered inventory costs, freed up capital, and forced suppliers to maintain consistent quality. Any defective part immediately halted production, creating immediate pressure to fix quality issues rather than hiding them. British manufacturers stockpiled inventory, assuming problems would emerge, and planned around inevitable waste. This approach locked up millions in inventory capital. Toyota implemented total quality management. Quality control was not segregated into an inspection department at the end of production. Every worker was responsible for quality. Defects were caught immediately, not discovered months later when the vehicle reached customers. Root causes of problems were investigated systematically. Workers were trained not just to do their jobs, but to understand why they did their jobs that way. They could recognize when something was going wrong and stop the production line to fix it. This revolutionary power, stopping the line, was unthinkable in British factories. The result was staggering. By the 1970s, Japanese automobiles had superior reliability ratings from consumer organizations. By the 1980s, they dominated global markets. British automobile manufacturers, including the once mighty Austin and Morris, collapsed. British Leyland, formed through government-mandated mergers, became synonymous with poor quality and labour disputes. The workers were blamed. The management was blamed. Nobody seemed to recognise that the system itself was fundamentally obsolete. Electronics and precision manufacturing. Japanese innovation went beyond automobiles. Japanese companies systematised manufacturing excellence across industries. In consumer electronics, Japanese innovation left British manufacturers far behind. Philco, Mullard, and other British electronics giants that had dominated the radio and television markets in the 1950s faced Japanese competition that was more efficient, more reliable, and more innovative. Sony, Panasonic, and other Japanese companies did not merely copy Western designs, they improved them. They understood that in consumer markets, reliability and features mattered as much as initial price. Britain had early advantages in computing and semiconductors through companies like Ferranti and GEC, yet these companies failed to maintain momentum. Japanese manufacturers like Toshiba, Mitsubishi, and NEC invested aggressively in manufacturing scale and efficiency. They accepted lower profit margins to gain market share. They reinvested profits into R&D and manufacturing improvements. They built factories with cutting-edge automation. The philosophy behind the performance. The Japanese advantage was not merely technical, it was philosophical. Japanese management emphasized long-term thinking. Companies accepted lower short-term profits to build market position and technological capability. Toyota was willing to take only 1% profit margins to gain market share, knowing that scale would eventually drive profitability. British and American companies, increasingly focused on quarterly earnings and shareholder returns, made different choices. Japanese companies viewed employees differently. Workers were not interchangeable parts to be hired and fired based on economic cycles. Employees were assets to be developed, trained and retained. Companies invested in worker education. Workers understood the broader production process. British manufacturers laid off workers during downturns, destroying institutional knowledge and creating adversarial relationships. When the economy recovered, companies had to rehire and retrain new workers. The specific case studies. The motorcycle industry provides a clear example. British motorcycles, Triumph, BSA, Norton, were legendary. They had sophisticated designs and strong brand loyalty. These machines were hand-assembled by skilled craftsmen. Quality control relied on experienced inspectors who could identify problems through observation and testing. Customization was common but costly. Tooling changes took time and money. Japanese motorcycles, particularly Honda, were initially dismissed as cheap copies, yet Honda approached motorcycles systematically. They automated assembly where possible. By the early 1970s, Honda was outselling British manufacturers globally. Honda's Goldwing motorcycle represented peak sophistication, reliable, comfortable, innovative. British motorcycle production, which had dominated the world in the 1960s, collapsed within a decade. Triumph attempted modernisation but lacked capital. BSA faced similar struggles. Norton became a shadow of its former self. The industry that built the British motorcycle effectively disappeared. In machine tools, the story repeated. British manufacturers had built the world's finest precision machine tools, yet they became complacent. Japanese manufacturers, particularly Okuma and Moriseki, invested in automation and numerical control technology. They combined precision manufacturing with advanced automation. They made machine tools easier to operate, more reliable, and more productive. British machine tool manufacturers gradually lost market position and eventually disappeared. Steel manufacturing faced similar challenges. British steel struggled to compete with Japanese steelmakers who had built new mills with modern equipment and efficient processes. Instead of modernising existing outdated facilities, British managers delayed investment decisions. Japanese competitors captured global markets. When British steel finally received government support to modernise, it was already too late to recapture lost position. Obstacles and cultural factors. British manufacturing faced specific obstacles beyond competition. Labour disputes became endemic. British unions, defending worker rights against management tactics that workers perceived as unfair, engaged in strikes that crippled production. Management, viewing these conflicts as battles to be won rather than problems to be solved cooperatively, took hardline positions. Meanwhile, Japanese manufacturers built cooperative relationships with unions focused on shared success. Workers benefited from company success through profit sharing and job security. British management culture emphasised individual achievement and status. Manufacturing was viewed as less prestigious than finance or professional services. The brightest minds went into the city rather than into improving factories. Japanese culture viewed manufacturing as honourable and important. Creating products that served customers reliably was valued. Engineers in manufacturing companies had prestige. Capital flowed toward manufacturing improvement. Motorcycle production went from a global industry employing tens of thousands to near zero in Britain. Machine tool companies that had centuries of history simply disappeared. The Japanese didn't accomplish this through revolutionary breakthroughs alone. They accomplished it through systematic, continuous improvement in every aspect of manufacturing. They respected workers. They invested in quality. They thought long-term. They learned from every source but adapted learning to their circumstances. They combined ancient principles of continuous improvement with modern manufacturing techniques. More importantly, they understood that manufacturing was not a necessary evil, but a core competency worthy of investment and innovation. The story of how Japanese innovation outpaced British engineering giants is not about Japan becoming more clever or British becoming less capable. It is about two different systems competing and one system being better adapted to modern manufacturing reality. The British system valued tradition, hierarchy, and established processes. The Japanese system valued learning, flexibility, and continuous improvement. The lesson applies beyond manufacturing. In any competitive field, the organisation that continuously improves learns from its environment, respects and develops its people, and thinks long-term will eventually surpass organisations that protect established positions and value short-term results. Britain's dominance lasted centuries. Japan's challenge of that dominance took decades. Which system will dominate the next century depends on which organisations and nations embrace continuous improvement and learning most effectively. The giants of British engineering fell not because they were weak, but because they refused to believe they could improve. Japan's rise succeeded not because it was uniquely gifted, but because it systematically pursued excellence in everything it did. That is the true story of how innovation outpaced tradition.